The folder sat there for years. Everyone in the palace knew it existed, hidden away in a place where prying eyes couldn't find it. Nobody wanted to touch it. Nobody wanted to know what was inside, but Prince William finally opened it, and the moment he did, everything changed. What he found inside drew a permanent line right through the middle of Camilla's royal future. Not her present, not her title. But what that title could actually do, and who it could affect once King Charles was no longer on the throne. Here's the part that gets me. The most fascinating thing about all of this isn't even the instruction itself. It's the fact that Queen Elizabeth sat on this decision quietly, deliberately, knowing full well that it would eventually have to be delivered by her grandson to his own father. And she did it anyway. Think about that. She didn't leave it for Charles to discover after she was gone. She didn't bury it in some dusty archive hoping nobody would ever find it. She documented it, preserved it, and made sure it would surface exactly when it was needed most. That's not a monarch reacting to a crisis. That's a monarch architecting a future she knew would be messy long after she left the room. So let's paint this picture. William walked into the room carrying a folder, and that already tells you this wasn't a casual family chat. You don't bring a folder to dinner unless you're about to say something that needs documentation. He placed it on the table, looked at his father, looked at Camilla, and made it clear this wasn't a conversation dressed up as duty. This was duty finally breaking through a family conversation, which is honestly a distinction the palace has blurred so many times over the years that most people stop being able to tell the difference. But William apparently could, and he wasn't interested in softening the edges anymore. The instruction inside that folder stated that Camilla's title must remain ceremonial, tied to Charles's reign, and never used as independent authority over the future monarchy. Right away, you can see the architecture of what Queen Elizabeth was worried about. She wasn't trying to humiliate Camilla. She was trying to build a wall between the present reign and the next one, specifically to protect Catherine's future before anyone could quietly blur the lines. And that's where this gets really interesting, because the word ceremonial is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. In royal terms, ceremonial means you stand where you're told. You smile when you're supposed to, you attend the events, you carry the dignity, but you don't shape the decision. You don't guide access, you don't influence the preparation of the next reign, and the instruction explicitly said Camilla's title must never be used to influence the position of the future queen. Future queen meaning Catherine, so this wasn't abstract constitutional theory. This was Queen Elizabeth looking at her grandson's wife and deciding her role needed to be protected before anyone had even tried to challenge it. That's foresight. But it's also a pretty brutal assessment of what she thought might happen if the boundaries weren't drawn clearly. Charles, understandably, was devastated. He lowered his eyes when William revealed the document. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He just stared at the folder like the weight of his mother's words had crossed the room and landed directly on his chest, and you can understand why. He spent decades protecting Camilla from judgment, from public hostility, from the shadow of Diana, from everything. He finally got her to a place of acceptance, got her the title of Queen Consort, got the public to stop openly resenting her, and now his own mother's final instruction is telling him that acceptance has limits. That's a specific kind of pain. It's not rejection, it's containment. And in some ways, containment is harder to fight because it sounds reasonable. You can rage against being cast out. It's much harder to rage against being told you're honored but bounded. Camilla didn't move. She sat frozen as the meaning settled around her. And I think that detail matters because Camilla has survived decades of public scrutiny. She's not someone who shocks easily, but this wasn't a tabloid headline or a poll number. This was the late monarch whose approval she had worked so carefully to earn, defining the limits of her role in writing. Her title wasn't being stripped away. Her dignity wasn't being publicly erased, but its power was being defined. And that definition was devastating because it made clear that all the work she'd done to be accepted still didn't grant her influence over what comes next. Now William closed the folder slowly, and that sound apparently echoed through the room in a way that felt like one era ending before the next had even begun. He said the instruction had been known only to a narrow circle, because nobody wanted to force the family into this reckoning too soon. Then he added that there was one more person who had to hear the Queen's words directly, without protection, without delay, without careful palace language. That person was Camilla herself. So William wasn't just delivering a document to his father. He was insisting that Camilla face it head-on, which is a very different dynamic than letting Charles absorb it privately and filter it through his own protective instincts. William wanted her to hear it directly. That's a power move, but it's also a clarity move. No intermediaries, no softening, just the instruction as it was written. But before Camilla could face those words, the palace had to confront the truth about everyone standing in the room. Behind every royal title stood a human wound, and this revelation opened all of them at once. William carried the burden of inheritance. Charles carried the ache of divided loyalty. Camilla carried the shock of a title suddenly surrounded by limits, and Catherine, silent but watchful, understood that the Queen's final instruction was not only about the past. It was about the future waiting for her. That's the part I think a lot of commentary misses. Catherine didn't ask for this, she didn't campaign for it, she wasn't in the room making demands, but she was the person the instruction was designed to protect. And that puts her in an incredibly complicated position. She can't celebrate it, she can't even acknowledge it publicly without looking like she's gloating. But she also knows that the late Queen essentially reached beyond her own reign to guard Catherine's future place. That's a heavy thing to carry quietly. William knew the room had changed the moment the words left his mouth. He was no longer only a son speaking before his father. He was the future king defending the shape of the monarchy before emotion could bend it out of place. That's the core tension of this entire situation. William wasn't acting as a son who resents his stepmother. He was acting as the person who will inherit the crown and needs it to arrive intact. If Camilla's title was allowed to grow beyond ceremony, then Catherine's future place could be pulled into uncertainty before her time had even come. And if that happened, the transition between reigns would be clouded by competing claims of influence. Queen Elizabeth clearly saw that possibility and decided to prevent it. Charles felt that danger, but he also felt the cruelty of it. He'd spent years protecting Camilla from judgment, from memory, from the shadow of old wounds that never fully disappeared. Now he was being asked to accept that his mother's final wishes still stood above his personal devotion. He looked toward Camilla, and for a moment his silence said what his voice couldn't. He loved her. He had chosen her. But he had also inherited a throne built on rules older than any private promise he'd ever made. That's the paradox of being king. You have ultimate authority in theory, but in practice, you're bound by centuries of precedent and the explicit instructions of the monarch who came before you. Camilla's pain surfaced in the smallest way. She gripped the edge of her chair, not dramatically, not loudly, but tightly enough for Catherine to notice. That detail is so telling because it shows Camilla was processing this internally, trying to maintain composure while the ground shifted beneath her. She understood the message behind the polished language. Her title remained respected, but respect was not the same as control. She could stand beside Charles, share ceremonies, and carry dignity in public. Yet the Queen's instruction placed a wall between her role and the future monarchy. That wall was invisible to the crowd outside, but inside the palace, everyone could feel it rising. Catherine watched William with quiet concern. She knew his calm voice was costing him more than anyone admitted. Challenging Charles's household meant stepping into a family wound that had never fully healed, and the future queen understood why he had delayed this moment for as long as possible. Still, the instructions suggested Queen Elizabeth had seen this danger long before the family was willing to name it. The monarch had not acted from panic. She had acted from foresight. Then a senior aide moved a sealed envelope across the table. The gesture was silent, but it struck the room like a confession. The file contained more than one page, and the next page didn't point forward. It pointed back. And the deeper the family looked into the Queen's reasoning, the clearer it became that one forgotten moment had started the entire crisis. Every royal crisis has a moment that later looks small until history turns back and points directly at it. For Queen Elizabeth, that moment came during a private Windsor title consultation when a simple ceremonial discussion turned into a warning. What happened in that room didn't explode in public. It did something far more dangerous. It stayed hidden, hardened, and waited. Now, a title consultation is basically a private discussion about how royal names, ranks, and ceremonial roles should be used in official life. It sounds boring, but it's actually where the real power struggles happen because whoever controls the language controls the perception. And this particular consultation took place after a memorial service when emotions were already raw. Camilla's advisors had pressed for language that would move her title closer to sovereign authority, closer meaning closer to the kind of power normally held by the monarch alone. The Queen listened without rushing to judgment. She had William nearby, Charles present, and a senior courtier watching every careful pause as the conversation tightened. At first, it sounded like a matter of wording, then it became something else. Charles tried to soften the tone, hoping to keep the discussion from turning against Camilla, but the damage came in one phrase: shared royal authority. The king, still then a son under his mother's reign, knew instantly that the words had gone too far. He tried to pull the room back towards ceremony, but the monarch had already heard the warning hidden beneath the polish. William saw the change before anyone explained it. His grandmother set down her pen without finishing her note, and that small act froze the room. The prince never forgot it. The Queen wasn't angry in a loud way. She was colder than that, steadier than that, because she understood what was being tested. If Camilla's title could be pushed beyond respect and into authority, then the future line of the crown could one day become clouded by emotion, loyalty, and competing claims of influence. So the queen acted after the consultation ended. She privately dictated the instruction that now stood at the center of the crisis, defining Camilla's role as honored but limited, respected but never sovereign in reach. And here's the thing that Camilla would later feel most deeply. The file wasn't born from dislike, it was born from fear. Fear that during a future transition, the monarchy could blur the difference between the woman beside the king and the crown that would one day pass to William and Catherine. Charles struggled with that truth because it made his love feel like a constitutional problem. Camilla would struggle because it made her dignity feel conditional. And William would struggle because the old consultation had become the weapon no one wanted to lift, yet everyone now knew had to be used. But a hidden instruction can only remain quiet for so long. When Camilla finally heard it spoken aloud, the palace atmosphere broke. The meeting began with protocol, but it didn't stay that way. No aide stepped forward, no press secretary softened the blow. William stood across from Camilla with the queen's instruction between them while Charles remained painfully still beside her. The silence wasn't empty. It was crowded with years of sacrifice, resentment, loyalty, and the one question no one dared ask out loud. William had asked for this conversation because palace language had finally failed. The prince knew that once too many people stood between pain and truth, the truth became weaker with every careful phrase. He wanted no institutional buffer, no office speaking for another office, no advisor translating duty into something gentler. Charles understood the danger of that choice at once. A private royal conversation, meaning a closed family discussion where decisions are shaped before they become official, could either heal what had been wounded or expose what everyone had tried to bury. Camilla felt the pressure before the first decisive sentence was spoken. She looked at William and asked whether he believed she had overstepped. Her voice didn't break, but the question carried years of judgment inside it. The prince answered with painful care. He said the instruction was not written to shame her, but because the queen believed boundaries were necessary. That word changed the air. Boundaries, not rejection, not exile, but a line drawn so clearly that even dignity couldn't cross it without consequence. Charles pushed back then softly, but with force. The king asked why his mother's instruction had to be raised now after the family had survived so much damage, after Camilla had endured so much public punishment, after his own reign had finally begun to breathe. He wasn't defending ambition. He was defending the woman beside him, yet William couldn't let love become law. The prince knew the crown survived because personal loyalty bowed before structure. And that structure mattered because the future monarchy would one day belong to him and Catherine, not to the unresolved emotions of the present reign. William read the decisive line aloud. Camilla's title must never be used to influence the position of the future queen. The words landed with brutal clarity. The future queen meant Catherine, the woman who would one day stand beside William when the next reign began, and the instruction protected her role before any confusion could grow around it. Camilla finally understood the full force of what had been hidden. Her ceremonial reach was not merely being measured, it was being contained. Charles reached for the document, but William didn't hand it over immediately. That pause said more than refusal ever could. The prince wasn't keeping paper from his father. He was protecting control of the instruction itself because whoever held it held the power to define what Camilla's title could and couldn't become. And that hesitation revealed the deeper power struggle beneath the title, because the question was no longer what Camilla could be called, but who controlled the crown's future. Titles are never just names inside a monarchy. They decide access, precedence, influence, and memory. The queen understood that better than anyone, so when her final instructions surfaced, it didn't merely wound Camilla's pride. It exposed the machinery beneath the velvet. Who could sign, who could advise, who could enter the room, and who had the right to shape what came next. William understood that this was the part no one wanted spoken aloud. Camilla's title still carried ceremony, respect, and public dignity, but the instructions separated symbolism from governing influence. Ceremony meant the public duties, greetings, appearances, and honors that surround royal life. Influence meant something far more dangerous, the power to shape decisions, guide access, and affect how the next reign would be prepared. The prince knew that difference mattered because the monarchy could survive discomfort, but it couldn't survive blurred authority at the very top. Charles stared at the wording as if every line had been written against his heart. The king had spent years proving that Camilla belonged beside him, and now he was being forced to accept that belonging didn't mean unlimited reach. A senior courtier noticed how long he looked at the page without turning it. That silence told the room everything. Charles wasn't only reading his mother's limit on Camilla. He was absorbing the fact that the late monarch had planned for a future where his love couldn't be allowed to reshape the crown. Catherine felt the cost in a different way. Away from the pressure of the room, she sat down a cup of tea, untouched, shaken by the knowledge that her future role was being defended through conflict. The future queenly position meant the place Catherine would one day hold beside William when he became monarch, and the instruction protected that place before confusion could gather around it. She didn't seek a battle with Camilla. She didn't need one. Yet the queen's words had placed her at the center of a struggle she had tried so carefully to avoid. William then learned the deeper truth. Certain palace officers had known enough to stay quiet. They had avoided discussing the instruction because no one wanted to force Charles into choosing between the woman beside him and the mother who had ruled before him. That avoidance had protected peace for a time, but it had also allowed uncertainty to grow. Now ceremonial decisions involving Camilla would face tighter review whenever they touched succession symbolism, future precedents, or Catherine's coming role. Camilla would feel those changes before the public understood them. She still had honor, but honor now came with limits. And once those limits moved from private pages into daily palace practice, the first consequences began to arrive. The palace could absorb a private argument, but it couldn't hide the practical changes that followed, and those changes cut directly into Camilla's daily royal life. The fallout didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with revised schedules, removed initials, delayed approvals, and doors that no longer opened as easily as they once had. For Camilla, the humiliation wasn't public at first. It was quieter than that. A briefing she wasn't invited to, a ceremonial note rewritten, a corridor where everyone suddenly knew, but no one dared say why. Camilla felt the change before anyone explained it to her. She arrived expecting a scheduled briefing, the kind of controlled palace discussion where duties were arranged, appearances were polished, and every title was placed exactly where it was meant to stand. But this time the room had been reduced. Her senior advisor wasn't present. The agenda had been narrowed. A member of staff, careful but shaken, told her the meeting had been moved to a smaller format. That single sentence carried the force of a public insult, even though no public voice had spoken it. William's office called it clarification, not punishment. The prince insisted the changes reflected the boundaries left by the queen, not a personal campaign against Camilla. Yet palace staff understood the deeper meaning. Ceremonial protocols, the rules that decide how royal roles are handled at official events, were being adjusted wherever Camilla's title touched succession imagery. Succession imagery meant the symbols, wording, and arrangements that point toward the next reign. That mattered because Catherine's future place couldn't be left vulnerable to soft language, blurred authority, or emotional pressure from the present. Charles didn't take the shift quietly. The king closed the folder sharply in front of aides, and the sound cut through the room like a warning. He knew what was happening. Private family pain had become administrative reality. What had begun as a sealed instruction was now reshaping calendars, briefings, programs, and access. Charles had survived public storms before, but this wound was different because it came wrapped in his mother's authority. He could defend Camilla with love, but he couldn't easily defy the queen without weakening the crown he had inherited from her. Camilla noticed the next blow in a ceremonial program. Her title remained there, dignified and untouched. Yet the surrounding language had changed. It no longer suggested influence beyond Charles's reign. It no longer allowed anyone to confuse respect with command. She understood the cruelty of that balance, honored enough to stand beside the king, limited enough to be reminded that the future didn't belong to her. William approved the change quietly after rereading the instruction alone. The prince didn't look victorious. He looked burdened. Every signature pulled him further from the comfort of being a son and deeper into the lonely discipline of becoming a king. The crisis now demanded more than rules. It demanded a turning point, and that turning point couldn't come from offices, papers, or ceremonial edits. After the doors began to close, only one conversation remained capable of stopping the family from breaking completely. Sometimes the monarchy survives not through ceremony, but through two people speaking honestly when no one is listening. William and Charles had stood on opposite sides of the instruction, but beneath the titles were a son and a father carrying grief in different forms. In that private moment, the battle over Camilla's title became something more painful, a reckoning over love, duty, and the queen's shadow. William asked for the conversation because the crisis had gone too far to be handled by offices. The prince wanted no aides, no advisors, and no careful palace language standing between him and his father. Charles agreed, but not because he felt ready. He agreed because the king understood that silence had already done damage. The instruction had moved from sealed paper into daily life, and now father and son had to face what it had done to them. A private conversation in the royal sense meant more than two people speaking alone. It meant the moment before a family wound became an official position. The last chance to speak with feeling before duty hardened everything into policy. Charles entered with the exhaustion of a man carrying both crown and heartbreak. He saw the framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth resting nearby, and for a moment, the room seemed to belong to her more than either of them. He admitted with rare softness that he felt he was being asked to choose against his own mother. The confession hit William harder than anger would have. The prince had expected resistance. He had prepared for authority, but he hadn't prepared for the pain in his father's voice. The kind of pain that made every royal rule feel suddenly human. William answered carefully because one wrong phrase could reopen everything. He told Charles he wasn't trying to diminish Camilla. He was trying to protect the crown from confusion the queen had clearly feared. That mattered because the crown wasn't only the person wearing it. It was the line of trust that carried the monarchy from one reign to the next. If Camilla's title were allowed to stretch beyond ceremony, Catherine's future place could be placed under pressure before William's reign even began. The prince needed his father to see that this wasn't revenge, it was protection. Charles finally accepted what he had avoided saying aloud. The instruction was real. It was binding not because it was easy and not because it spared anyone. It came from the monarch who had built the modern reign through discipline, patience, and sacrifice. The king knew he could disagree with the pain it caused, but he couldn't pretend it had no authority. William offered the only mercy he could. Camilla would be treated with dignity. Her title would remain respected, but it wouldn't reshape Catherine's future role. It wouldn't blur the monarch's next chapter. Father and son reached a fragile understanding, not warm enough to heal everything, but strong enough to stop the break from becoming permanent. But private acceptance inside the palace meant nothing until the world outside saw what had changed and decided what it believed. By morning, the story no longer belonged only to the family. It belonged to Britain, to broadcasters, to newspapers, to crowds outside palace gates, and to everyone who understood that royal titles are never merely decorative. The Queen's final instruction had crossed from private inheritance into public judgment, and one front page turned the entire crisis into a national image. William knew the private understanding with Charles wouldn't stay private for long. The prince had accepted his father's pain, but now the country was being asked to accept the consequence. A major newspaper carried the story in a way no palace statement could soften. William, Charles, and Camilla placed beneath the headline, the Queen's final line. Those 5 words struck hard because they made the crisis simple. The Queen had drawn a boundary. William had revealed it. Charles had accepted it. And Camilla now had to live within it. Broadcasters seized on the meeting immediately. They framed the revelation as a historic clarification of Camilla's role, not as a removal, but as a limit that changed the emotional balance of the reign. That mattered because the public had always understood royal titles as symbols of honor. Yet this story showed they were also tools of power. A title could open doors, shape access, and influence how the future was prepared. Now viewers were being told that the late monarch had guarded that future even from beyond her reign, and William had become the one forced to carry out her final line. Camilla felt the public weight before the palace finished its response. She saw the front page at breakfast, folded the paper once, and left it beside her plate without finishing her tea. She didn't need anyone to explain the humiliation. Her title remained respected, but the nation had now seen the boundary around it. The private wound had become a public shape. For Charles, that was another blow. The king had tried to protect her from being reduced to a controversy. Yet the very instruction that preserved the crown had exposed her pain to the country. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered in uneasy silence. Some came out of loyalty to the Queen's memory. Some came because they sensed history shifting in real time. One elderly woman spoke the phrase that cut through the noise. The Queen knew it had to be protected. It was simple, but it carried the mood of the morning. People weren't just reacting to Camilla. They were reacting to William, to Catherine, to Charles, and to the future monarchy suddenly made visible through one old instruction. Palace officials released carefully controlled language, affirming respect for Camilla while confirming that future precedents would follow the Queen's instruction. Precedents meant the order of rank and importance in royal life, and now that order had been publicly tied to Catherine's future role. Commentators understood the deeper shock. Catherine hadn't fought for protection. The late monarch had provided it. William had only revealed what had already been decided. With the public now aware the family could no longer hide behind silence, the question had changed from what happened inside the palace to what it meant for everyone touched by the crown. And when the noise finally faded, what remained wasn't scandal, but the painful verdict Queen Elizabeth had left behind. In the end, the revelation didn't destroy the monarchy. It clarified it. The Queen's final instruction didn't erase Camilla, humiliate Charles, or crown William early. It did something colder, wiser, and more permanent. It drew a line between affection and authority, between title and power, between the woman beside the king and the future waiting beyond his reign. William understood that the final judgment had never belonged to anger. The prince hadn't stepped forward as a rebel son trying to overpower his father. He had stepped forward as the guardian of a boundary the late monarch believed the crown needed. The crown in plain terms wasn't just the physical object placed on a sovereign's head. It was the continuing authority, duty, and trust that passed from one reign to the next. That was why this moment mattered. It protected the future from confusion, and it forced the present to accept limits. Charles accepted the decision without another argument. The king placed the file back on the table and touched its edge as if he were saying goodbye to a battle he could no longer win. He had defended Camilla with loyalty. He had carried her through storms that would have broken weaker hearts, but now he understood the painful truth. Love could explain his resistance, but it couldn't erase his mother's instruction. The monarch had spent a lifetime teaching the family that duty came first. And now that lesson had returned to him in the hardest possible form. Camilla felt the ending in silence. She didn't explode, didn't demand another hearing, and didn't try to turn dignity into defiance. She stood alone after the door closed, wounded by the knowledge that her title remained honored but carefully contained. A royal title could bring respect, ceremony, and public grace, but it couldn't automatically bring ultimate power. Camilla knew now that acceptance was the only way to keep the dignity she still had. Catherine's future position stood protected, not through palace rivalry, but through the Queen's last deliberative act of judgment. William had revealed what the monarch had left behind, and Catherine's place beside him was no longer vulnerable to blurred language or private pressure. That was the revelation beneath the scandal. Camilla could stand beside Charles, but she couldn't redefine what came after him. This moment meant that the Queen's reign still shaped the monarchy after her death. William proved he would defend its future. Charles paid the emotional price of loyalty. Camilla learned that honor without ultimate authority was still honor but never command. This was the final meaning of the Queen's instruction. The crown could show mercy, affection, and respect, but when the future of the monarchy was at stake, duty had the last word.